The
I
sun
love
was the
you so
kind of
much.
bright
I love
that
you
made
more.
everything look
This
perfect.
feels like a dream.
It
A
shone
perfect
on the
dream.
white chairs,
I
the
do.
flowers that cost
I
more
do.
than most people's
You
monthly
may now
rent,
kiss the bride.
and the happy, smiling faces of two
I
families
love you more than words
about
can
to become
say.
one.
And I
Well,
love you
one
with
family
all my
was
heart.
smiling brightly. The other
With this
was
ring, I
smiling
thee wed?
tightly.
And I thee
On
wed,
one side
with
were
all
the
that I
bride's
am and all
parents.
that I have.
And I
Let's
you.
call them Robert
I
and
do.
Susan. Robert had a laugh
may now
that was
kiss the
just a
bride.
little too loud,
I love
and a way of standing that said, "Look at me." Susan's dress was so elegant, it seemed to whisper money. They moved through the
I
guests
do.
like friendly
I do.
sharks, perfectly
I
at
love you.
home in the luxury
you
they had
too.
paid for. On the other side were the groom's parents. His father, a man we'll call Joseph, stood quietly near
You
the
two are
back.
just perfect.
He wore a
Thank you
suit
for
that was
everything.
clean and
We
neat,
love you.
but the cut was simple.
You look
the
wonderful,
fabric
son.
ordinary.
There, all set.
His hands,
Thanks,
resting
everyone.
at
It means
his
a lot.
sides,
Of course.
were broad and marked with old, faint scars and calluses, the kind that don't wash off. He watched his son, his eyes soft with pride, but his body was still, like a tree in a gentle wind. The problem started after the ceremony, during the fancy cocktail hour. Robert, with a glass of expensive champagne in his hand, found Joseph looking at a beautiful ice sculpture of two swans. "Impressive, isn't it?" Robert said, clapping a heavy hand on Joseph's shoulder. "The artist flies in from Venice. Just for this. Of course, when you're paying for a once-in-a-lifetime event, you spare no expense, right?" Joseph simply nodded. "It's very beautiful. The children look happy." "They do," Robert boomed. Then his eyes dropped to Joseph's wrist. He wore a simple, old-fashioned watch with a worn leather strap. "Ah, I see you're a practical man. No flashy jewelry. Wise. These fancy designer watches they have nowadays are just for show anyway." A few people nearby chuckled politely. Joseph's wife, let's call her Anita, slipped her arm through his and gave a small, forced smile. It got worse when they sat down for dinner. Robert stood up to give his father of the bride speech. He talked about his daughter's brilliance, her beauty, and how she deserved a fairy tale. Then he turned to the groom. "And we are so glad she found such a wonderful young man," Robert said, his voice taking on a joking tone. "A man of character, who clearly wasn't raised to need flashy things or big shows. He comes from real stock. Simple, honest people." The gaze of the room shifted to Joseph. He sat straight, his face calm, but a muscle in his jaw tightened just a little. Robert wasn't finished. "I remember when we first met," he continued, chuckling. "I offered to take us all out to my club for dinner. Joseph here asked if they served good meatloaf." The crowd erupted in laughter. Robert wiped an imaginary tear from his eye. "I love that. Salt of the earth. It's a good reminder for all of us, living in our bubbles, that what really matters isn't the fancy sauce, but the quality of the meat, right, Joseph?" The laughter felt hot and heavy in the air. The groom looked down at his plate, his ears red. Anita's hand, under the table, was gripping Joseph so hard her knuckles were white. But Joseph just lifted his glass slightly toward Robert and took a small, slow sip of water. He didn't smile, but he didn't look angry either. He looked patient. Later, as the band started playing and people began to dance, Robert was still in a merry mood, fueled by wine and his own performance. He saw Joseph standing alone near the terrace doors, looking out at the darkening gardens. "Not much of a dancer, eh?" Robert said, coming up beside him. His tone was friendly, but it had that sharp edge of someone who believes they are being charming. "Don't worry about it. These events can be a lot if you're not used to them. All the rules which fork to use." He leaned in, a cloud of expensive cologne surrounding them. "Tell you what, if it gets too overwhelming, I'm sure the kitchen staff wouldn't mind you hanging out back there. Probably more your speed. No judgment here." For the first time that evening, Joseph turned and looked directly at Robert. His eyes were a steady, quiet blue. He didn't look hurt or angry. He looked like a man who was weighing a very heavy decision. "Thank you for your concern, Robert," Joseph said, his voice low and even. "But I'm right where I need to be." He walked away then, leaving Robert standing there with a slightly confused smile. Robert shook his head, turned to a nearby guest, and said in a voice meant to carry, "Lovely man," just a bit out of his depth. "Thank God my daughter married the son, and not the father, right?" The guest laughed awkwardly, but the words hung in the air, ugly and final. The humiliation was complete. In front of 200 people, the groom's father had been painted as a simple, backwards man. A charity case to be tolerated at this grand event. What Robert didn't see was Anita, pulling Joseph into a quiet corner behind a large floral arrangement. Her eyes were blazing. "Why?" She hissed, her voice trembling not with sadness, but with fury. "After everything, after what you did for that man, why do you just stand there and take it?" Joseph looked at his wife, his strong, calm face finally showing a flicker of deep weariness. He took both her hands in his, those rough, scarred hands, covering her smooth ones. "We agreed, my love," he said softly. "A long time ago. A gift with strings is no gift. It's a chain. It was his business to save, not mine to own. He doesn't know, and that's how it should be. But he's making a fool of you," Anita whispered fiercely. "He's making our son's wedding a joke about where he comes from." "He's making a fool of himself," Joseph corrected gently. "And our son knows where he comes from. That's all that matters tonight." He gave her hands a final squeeze and walked back toward the party, leaving Anita standing in the scent of 1,000 roses, her heart aching for a justice she had promised never to demand. She didn't know it then, but the truth, like a seed planted long ago, was already beginning to push its way toward the light. The party hummed along, a beautiful machine of music and laughter. But for a few people, the music sounded far away, drowned out by the echo of harsh words. The bride's father, Robert, felt great. He had given a funny speech, everyone had laughed, and he was surrounded by friends. He saw the groom's father, Joseph, sitting quietly with his wife at their table. To Robert, the man looked a bit lost. He felt a twinge of something not guilt, but a sense of duty. Maybe he should go and make the poor fellow feel more included. Meanwhile, Joseph's wife, Anita, was not lost. She was furious. She watched Robert moving through the crowd, slapping backs, his loud laugh cutting through the air. Every time she heard it, she flinched. She leaned closer to her husband, her voice a low, tight whisper. "I just heard him," she said, telling the man from the bank about how he took a chance on our family. A chance, as if our son isn't a brilliant, kind man who anyone would be lucky to have. Joseph placed a hand over hers on the table. His hand was warm and steady. "I know," he said simply. "But look at our son. Is he happy?" She looked across the room. Their son was dancing with his new wife, both of them smiling, eyes only for each other. The ugly words seemed to bounce right off of them. Anita felt her anger soften, just a little. "Yes," she admitted. "He is. Then that's the victory," Joseph said. "This day is for them. Not for Robert's speeches, not for my pride. Just for them." But Anita's eyes were still sharp with pain. "It's not just about pride, Joseph. It's about respect. He's not just insulting you. He's insulting the life we built, the values we taught our boy. He's calling our simple life less than his. And after what you did," Joseph's grip on her hand tightened almost imperceptibly. He murmured, a gentle warning. "That door is closed. We agreed never to open it." Back then, 3 years ago, Robert's business had been in deep trouble. A big deal fell apart, and he was about to lose everything: the company, his fancy house, all of it. He was desperate, calling everyone he knew. Joseph had heard about it from his son, who was worried about his future father-in-law. Joseph didn't have stacks of cash. What he had was a piece of land, left to him by his own father. It wasn't much, but it was paid for, free and clear. He went to the bank. He used that land as a promise to secure a loan for Robert. He didn't tell Robert he was doing it. He arranged it all through the bank manager, an old friend who agreed to keep Joseph's name out of it. The only condition was that Robert would never know where the lifeline came from. I don't want him looking at me, or at our son, and seeing a debt, Joseph had told Anita at the time. I want him to see a family. If he knows, we will never just be family. We will always be the people who saved him. Anita had agreed, though her heart had ached at the risk. That land was their safety net. But she trusted her husband's quiet wisdom. Now, watching Robert parade around like a king, she wondered if that trust had been a mistake. Across the hall, Robert finally made his way to their table. He pulled up a chair, his face beaming. "Enjoying yourselves?" he asked, his tone generous. "It's a beautiful wedding," Joseph said, nodding. "It really is," Robert sighed, satisfied. He leaned in. "You know, I have to thank you." In a way, Joseph raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Yes," Robert said, gesturing with his wine glass. "Seeing you here, being so genuine, it's a good reminder for my daughter. Money isn't everything. Character is. The way you live so simply, without all this." He waved his hand at the glittering room. "It's admirable, really." Every word was like a small, polite knife. Anita felt her smile freeze on her face. Joseph just listened. "I mean, take that watch," Robert continued, pointing again to Joseph's simple timepiece. "Probably tells the time as well as my expensive one, doesn't it? Maybe better." A young man, one of the groom's closest friends, walked past the table just then. He was a sharp-eyed guy who worked with numbers and money. He overheard Robert's comment about the watch and paused for a second, his eyes flicking from Robert's boasting face to Joseph's calm one. A faint line of confusion appeared between his brows, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he moved on. Robert, encouraged by his own speech, kept going. "It's like my business. 3 years ago, I was in a tight spot. Real tight. But I dug deep, used my wits, my connections, pulled myself up by my bootstraps. You have to, in this world. No one is going to just hand you a solution on a silver platter." At the word solution, Joseph and Anita exchanged a quick, invisible glance. A memory, hanging in the air between them. The paperwork, the quiet meeting at the bank, the fear of risking their own future. Joseph took a slow breath. "It's good you found a way out," he said, his voice flat. "Found a way?" Robert laughed. "I made a way. Had to beg a bit, call in every favor. But in the end, it was my name, my reputation that secured the loan. They knew I was good for it." The groom's friend, now standing with a small group near the bar, turned his head slightly. He was listening more carefully now. He knew a lot about loans, about bank requirements, about risk. He remembered the groom mentioning, once, a long time ago, how worried he was about his girlfriend's father's business. And then, suddenly, the crisis had vanished. He looked at Joseph again, this man who was being mocked for his simple watch. He looked at the watch closely. It was old, very old, and the design on its case was unusual. He'd seen a watch like that before, in a magazine article about rare, collectible pieces passed down through families. Not flashy, but worth more than a car. The pieces in his mind, disconnected and unimportant until now, began to tremble and shift, moving slowly toward each other. He took a sip of his drink, his eyes now carefully watching the two fathers at the table, one talking loudly, the other sitting in a silence that suddenly seemed very, very deep. The music from the band felt too cheerful now, a bright soundtrack to a sinking feeling in the room. The groom's friend, let's just call him the friend, couldn't let it go. The puzzle was clicking together in his head, and it was forming a picture that made his stomach turn. He remembered a late-night talk with the groom, maybe 2 years back. They were just hanging out, and the groom had been stressed. He'd said his girlfriend's dad was in big trouble, that the family business was about to go under and take their house with it. The groom had been worried for his girlfriend, worried about the shadow it was casting over everything. Then, a few months later, the problem had just vanished. The groom said it was a miracle loan, that the bank had suddenly given them a second chance. He'd been so relieved, he never questioned it, but the friend questioned everything. It was his job. He worked in finance, and miracle loans didn't exist without serious collateral, especially for a business already on the edge. Someone had to have backed it. He watched Robert, the bride's father, slap another guest on the back, boasting about his business smarts. He looked at Joseph, the groom's father, sitting with a patience that now looked less like shyness and more like strength. He made a decision. He weaved through the dancing crowd toward the bar, where he saw the groom's mother, Anita, standing alone for a moment, getting a glass of water. She looked tired, the happy mother smile gone from her eyes. "Ma'am?" The friend said gently. "Can I ask you something? A bit strange?" Anita looked at him, surprised, and nodded. "That watch your husband wears," the friend began, trying to sound casual. "It's really unique. I have an uncle who loves old watches. Is it a family piece?" Anita's eyes flickered with something caution and a deep, old sadness. "It was his father's," she said quietly, "and his father's before him. It's one of the few things he has left from them." The friend nodded, his heart beating faster. "It looks like a piece I read about once. A worker's watch, but made by a famous craftsman a long time ago. Very rare. More valuable than people would think." Anita was silent for a long moment. She took a slow sip of water, her eyes on her husband across the room. When she spoke, her voice was so low he had to lean in. His father sold his own truck to buy that watch for Joseph's grandfather as a thank you for a lifetime of partnership. Joseph would never sell it. Not for anything. Then she paused and added, almost to herself, but he would use the land they worked, the land that watch represents, to secure a future for someone else. The words hung in the air. The friend felt a chill. He would use the land. The final piece snapped into place. The loan wouldn't have been approved on Robert's struggling business alone. It would have needed solid property as a guarantee. Property owned free and clear. Just then, a roar of laughter erupted from Robert's circle. He was telling another story, his voice carrying. "And I told the bank manager, listen, this business is my life. You back me, and I'll triple your money. And he saw my vision, he saw my fire." The friend felt a hot rush of anger. He liked the groom. He respected the quiet, solid man being mocked. Without another word to Anita, who was now watching him with a wary understanding, he turned and walked straight toward the loud, laughing group. Robert saw him approaching and grinned, including him in the circle. "Ah, one of my new son's friends. Having a good time?" "I was," the friend said, his voice calm but with an edge that made a few people stop smiling. "It's a beautiful wedding. But you know, I work in finance, and I couldn't help overhearing you talk about your loan." Robert puffed out his chest. "Ah, a tough negotiation, but I won." "That's interesting," the friend said, crossing his arms, "because I know a bit about that bank. About 3 years ago, they were under a lot of pressure. They weren't giving out any risky loans unless they were backed by absolute rock-solid collateral. Like, say, a fully paid-off piece of land, property. Robert's smile faltered, just a little. Well, of course, the business assets were underwater, the friend interrupted politely but firmly. Everyone in the small circle had gone quiet. The music suddenly seemed too loud. Your assets were tied up, losing value. No bank would have touched that loan unless someone with real, tangible property stepped in and guaranteed it. Put their own home, their own family security, on the line for you. The color began to drain from Robert's face. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just thinking out loud, the friend said. He looked past Robert, directly at Joseph, who was now watching them from his table, his expression unreadable. I'm thinking that a miracle loan usually has a quiet angel behind it. Someone who doesn't want thanks, who probably made the bank promise not to reveal their name. Someone who believes a gift with strings isn't a gift at all. He turned his eyes back to Robert. You said no one handed you a solution on a silver platter. But I think someone did. They just handed you the platter itself and let you take all the credit for the meal. Silence. Complete silence in the little group. Robert's mouth was slightly open. He followed the friend's gaze across the room to where Joseph sat. He remembered the bank manager's strange insistence years ago that the terms were non-negotiable and the benefactor's name was confidential. He remembered the sudden, inexplicable approval. He had been so relieved, so eager to believe in his own cleverness, he never dug deeper. He looked at Joseph's simple suit. He looked at his own expensive clothes, paid for by the business that was saved. He thought of the jokes about meatloaf, about the watch, about the kitchen. His heart began to pound a sick, slow rhythm in his chest. The world didn't tilt, but it shifted. The glittering room, the proof of his success, suddenly looked different. It looked borrowed. It felt, for the first time, like it was built on someone else's quiet, forgotten sacrifice. The humiliation he had been dishing out all night came rushing back at him, not as laughter, but as a wave of shame so thick he could barely breathe. The silence that had fallen over Robert's little group was a small, heavy thing. The music and laughter from the rest of the wedding continued, a happy wave that just broke around their island of quiet. Robert felt his face grow hot, then cold. The friend's words were not an accusation, but they hit harder than one. They were just facts, laid out like stones on a path leading to a truth he had never wanted to see. He mumbled something, a weak excuse, and stepped away from his stunned friends. He needed air, but more than that, he needed to be away from all the eyes. He walked, not toward the terrace where the cool night waited, but almost blindly toward the back of the hall, past the restrooms, into a quieter corridor lined with pictures of the happy couple. He leaned against the wall, the fancy wallpaper cool against his back. His mind was racing, flipping through memories like pages in a book he'd read wrong 3 years ago. The panic, the calls to every contact, every so-called friend, who had all given him polite, empty words or simply didn't answer. The bank manager's stern face. Then the sudden shift. The manager had called him in, his tone different. Not friendly, but resolved. The loan was approved. The terms were unusual, stricter, but it was a lifeline. Robert had been so desperate, so focused on the salvation, he'd just scribbled his name on the papers. The manager had said, "The guarantor insists on anonymity. This is a gesture of faith, not a transaction. Respect that." At the time, Robert had thought it was some distant rich uncle, or a business rival playing a strange game. He had been too proud and too relieved to question it. He had tucked it away as a mystery, and then, as his business recovered, he had rewritten the story in his head. He became the hero. He had talked himself into believing his own passion had convinced the bank. Now, the real face of the guarantor was clear. It was Joseph, the quiet man with the rough hands, the man he joked about all evening. Joseph hadn't just co-signed a piece of paper. He had put his land, his family's land, his own security on the line for a man he barely knew, for a man who would later mock him. The thought made Robert feel sick. He thought of his jokes. Salt of the earth. He had said it like it was a cute, simple thing. But that land was the earth. It was Joseph's roots, his history, his safety net for his own family. And he had risked it. And the watch. Robert had mocked the watch. His stomach churned. That simple watch was a legacy. A father's love turned into metal and mechanics, passed down. While Robert had been buying flashy new things to show off his comeback, Joseph was holding on to the one piece of his past he refused to let go. Back in the main hall, the party was reaching a peak. The bride's mother, Susan, fluttered over to her husband, her face puzzled. "There you are. What's wrong? You look pale." Robert looked at his wife, her face full of the evening's perfect, planned joy. He opened his mouth, but the words were like ash. How could he explain? "Susan, the loan. The one that saved us." She blinked. "What about it?" "Thank God for it." "Do you ever wonder?" "Who?" Robert's voice was hoarse. "The bank said it was anonymous." "Who would do that?" Susan waved a hand, a little diamond bracelet glittering. "Some old business connection feeling sentimental. Who knows? Does it matter now? We paid it back." "It might matter," Robert said, his eyes searching the crowd. He found Joseph. He was dancing now, a slow, careful dance with his wife, Anita. She had her head on his shoulder, her eyes closed, looking more at peace than she had all night. Joseph's face, as he guided her, was gentle. He looked like a man who had no need to prove anything to anyone. Robert remembered his own father, a hard man who had built a small something from nothing. He remembered his father telling him, "Son, a real man isn't measured by the noise he makes, but by the weight of his silence and the strength of his word." Robert had spent a lifetime making noise. Thinking that was strength, he watched Joseph whisper something to his wife, and she smiled a real smile, not the tight one from dinner. That small, private moment held more dignity than all of Robert's loud toasts. He had to know. He had to be sure. He turned to his wife, his decision solidifying. "I need to make another toast." Susan looked horrified. "Another one?" "Robert, no. Your last one was." "Long enough. Let it be." "This one is different," he said, and his voice had a new tone. It wasn't the boastful boom. It was quieter, urgent. "I have to." He walked toward the band leader, his legs feeling unsteady. He asked for the microphone. As the music faded and the spotlight found him again, a ripple of curious expectation went through the crowd. People probably thought he was going to tell another funny story. The groom and bride, holding hands near the cake, looked at each other, a little worried. The groom's friend stood at the edge of the dance floor, arms crossed, watching carefully. Robert tapped the microphone. The sound echoed. He looked out at the sea of faces, but he only saw one. Joseph had stopped dancing and was standing with his wife, his expression calm, patient as always, waiting. I need to say something," Robert began. His voice was shaky. He cleared his throat. "Earlier tonight, I gave a speech. I tried to be funny. I talked about simple things and fancy things. I talked about how I built my business back up with my own two hands." He paused, the words sticking. The room was utterly silent now. "I was telling a story," he said, the admission hurting as it came out. "But it wasn't the whole story. The truth is, 3 years ago, my hands were empty. I was about to lose everything. And someone I didn't know very well, stepped in. They didn't offer me a handout. They did something bigger. They put everything they had, their own family security, on the line for me, for my family. And they asked for nothing, not even thanks. They wanted to remain a secret. He could see Joseph now, very clearly. Joseph's head was bowed slightly, as if he wished the floor would swallow him. Anita had her hand pressed over her mouth. I was too proud to look for this person, Robert continued, his eyes glistening. I was too happy to be saved to ask who the Savior was. I took the gift and I put my own name on it. And tonight, his voice broke. He took a deep, ragged breath. Tonight I made jokes. I made this person feel small. In my own pride, in my own blindness, I humiliated the very man who gave me back my life. A gasp, then a murmur, swept through the room. All eyes turned from Robert to Joseph. Robert looked directly at him, his vision blurry. I didn't realize the man in the simple suit, the man with the old watch, the man I thought was out of his depth, was the one who kept my head above water. I didn't realize I was mocking my own guardian angel. He let the microphone drop to his side for a second, the sound thudding through the speakers. The confession hung in the air, raw and real. The perfect, shiny wedding was gone. In its place was something more human, more fragile, and infinitely more beautiful. The real story of the two families had finally begun. The silence after Robert's words was complete. It wasn't an awkward silence, but a heavy, held breath kind of quiet, as if the entire room was absorbing a shock. All the glitter and music seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the raw truth hanging in the air. Every single person looked at Joseph. He stood perfectly still beside his wife. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't smile. He looked like a man whose deepest, most private secret had just been spoken aloud to a crowd. A faint pink flush colored his neck. His wife, Anita, had tears streaming silently down her face, but she was holding his arm, standing straight beside him. Robert was still on the small stage, the microphone hanging from his hand. He looked old suddenly and very tired. The proud, loud man from earlier was gone. "Joseph," he said, his voice cracking without the microphone's help, "I am so ashamed." That seemed to break the spell for Joseph. He gave his wife's hand a gentle squeeze, and then he began to walk. He didn't walk to the stage. He walked toward Robert. The crowd parted for him silently. His steps were slow and steady on the dance floor dot. When he reached the edge of the stage, he looked up at Robert. "You should get down from there," Joseph said, his voice low but clear in the quiet room. "This isn't a place for speeches anymore." Robert, looking confused and broken, simply nodded and stepped down. Now they stood on the same level, face to face, in front of everyone. Joseph looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something surprising. He put a hand on Robert's shoulder. It was the same shoulder Robert had clapped so heartily earlier in the night. "You asked for no names," Joseph said, so everyone could hear. "That was the condition. Not for me, but for you. I didn't want you to look at my son, or at me, and see a bill that needed to be paid. I wanted you to see a person. Just a person. When you help someone, it shouldn't become a chain around their neck." Robert's shoulders began to shake. He was trying not to cry, but the tears came anyway. "I called you simple," he choked out. "I made a joke of you. And I let you," Joseph said, his hand still firm on Robert's shoulder, "because my pride wasn't what mattered tonight. Their happiness was." He gestured toward the bride and groom, who were holding on to each other, watching with wide, emotional eyes. "You thought you were honoring your daughter with a big show. I thought I was honoring my son by staying quiet. Maybe we were both a little wrong. He paused, looking around at the room full of people, their faces soft with understanding. A gift is a gift. You don't build a statue for the giver. You use the gift and you live well. That's thanks enough. You built your business back, Robert. You did that. The land was just paper. The work was yours. This kindness, this refusal to take credit, even when it was being handed to him, was more powerful than any angry word could have been. Robert broke then. He covered his face with his hands, his body trembling with sobs of pure shame and relief. His wife, Susan, rushed to his side, her own face wet with tears. Holding him that Joseph finally took his hand from Robert's shoulder and turned to face the room. He looked at his son. "I'm sorry if this caused you pain on your day," he said. His son, the groom, shook his head, a proud, tearful smile on his face. "No, Dad, this is the best wedding gift anyone could have given us." The bride let go of her husband's hand and walked over to Joseph. She didn't say anything. She just wrapped her arms around him in a tight, heartfelt hug. After a moment, she went to her own father and hugged him just as tightly, bridging the space between the two men. That single action seemed to tell everyone what to do. The band leader, a wise man with kind eyes, picked up his guitar. He didn't play a loud, happy song. He started playing something soft and gentle and old, a melody that felt like forgiveness. Slowly, Pio,